So every logical reasoning stimulus will either be a fact set or an argument. If you're dealing with a fact set, it will typically be some sort of inference question or some sort of other like must be true, most supported, etc. Like it'll be something within this category. Those are all really the same thing, of course. If you're dealing with an argument, it's going to either have no gap or it'll have a gap. Of course, no gap arguments never really happen on the LSAT because that would be something like A requires B, B requires C, therefore A requires C. That's, of course, airtight. You can't strengthen it, can't weaken it, it's perfect, so they'll never include it because it's too simple. Instead, they'll include gap arguments. And gap arguments, you could have a small gap or a big gap. And this is where it gets interesting because the question becomes, how do we know whether the gap is small or it's big? And this is really not for us to judge specifically. LSAT tells us how to determine this based on the question type. So if you're asking, what should you read first, the question stem or the stimulus, I'm kind of torn on it because there are top scorers who do both ways, but I like question stem first because it tells you how to view the argument. If it's like a necessary assumption question, they're telling you, view it as a small gap, reasonable argument, not that it's fundamentally flawed. Give the arguer the benefit of the doubt, extend the principle of generosity to them, and say they didn't fail to consider something, they just did not bother to explicitly state whatever that thing is. On the other hand, if it's a big gap argument, they'll be saying it's a flaw question in the question stem. The argument is vulnerable to criticism, therefore you should view it as being a big gap argument. But I can easily take any argument with a gap and frame it as either necessary assumption or as flaw, depending on simply changing the question stem and of course the choices as well. Because if you have a gap, it means that you did not fully support your argument 100% like this. If it's not like this and there's a gap, you could view it either way. Of course, we have the idea of what is reasonable, but that's open to interpretation based on individual people's perceptions and how they judge things. So it's not really for you to say if it's small or big, it's the question type telling you. Now these, of course, are pretty clearly defined, but then strengthen and weaken and so on could be in either of these two categories. It's just all about whether there's a gap or not. But I think the question stem is telling you useful information here. If it's inference, if it's most supported or must be true, then you will likely be dealing with a fact set, but not always. Of course, there could be gaps in these arguments as well, but when you see a fact set, it'll almost certainly be one of these types of questions. And so that tells you, you see this, maybe fact set, probably fact set. Your job is not to evaluate any gaps, even if there are gaps present. That's not the task at hand. Your job is instead to see a potential paraphrase or a combination of multiple parts of the stimulus, but take everything as given. It's not your job to judge or evaluate. And then, of course, there's many other questions that I didn't cover here, like parallel, evaluate, sufficient assumption, and those are all going to usually be some kind of gap, but again, small or big, we don't know. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.